Hello, and welcome to another episode of Alan Drinks Whiskey and Talks About Books. Today we are talking about The Annual Migration of Clouds by Premee Mohamed. And this is a book that as soon as I read it, I knew I needed to do an episode on this one. And this is a very new book. I think it came out earlier this month. It is very new. Usually I don't do kind of new reviews, but this one I was able to pre-order. I was able to get it kind of right away, and I read it and I devoured this one. And I can't wait to talk to you about why. So here we go. Let's talk a little bit about the annual migration of clouds. I'm drinking a Woodford Reserve this afternoon. You see the sunlight coming on here. Again, this is a very low budget setup. It almost works better as a podcast, probably, but you know, it's neither here nor there. So I want to talk about climate fiction. I know you guys are shocked if you've been watching the channel for a while, but I recently listened to a book that was really fascinating to me, and it was called "The Great Derangement: Climate Change and the Unthinkable" by Amitav Ghosh, and I hope I said his name right. Um, I looked it up once, so I'm hopefully that I said it again. But anyway, "The Great Derangement," and it's basically about how climate change is real, but how we're not really equipped to deal with it on a number of different levels: politics, um, just infrastructure, things like that. But one of the things that he talked about was how culture prevents us from doing that. Culturally, we are not accepting of climate change and its realities. And one of the things that Goosh talked about was that authors who write about climate change and its effects get relegated to science fiction. And this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. Actually, one time I went to a AP literature training and we talked about the role of science fiction. And basically, it boiled down to the fact that if your students were to write about science fiction on an AP exam, that might not be deemed as literary merit unless you're talking like Frankenstein, end of list, because science fiction has a bad rap. It's not considered highbrow literature. It's not considered good. It's not where art is being made. And part of me gets it. I mean, if you think of like those pulp fiction novels in the 50s or the campiest episode of Star Trek that you can imagine. Look, Captain Kirk trying to get it on with a green alien, that's not inspiring anyone to think deeply. And yet, that does mask some of the very progressive messaging that happens within Star Trek. Um, and I think that's kind of indicative of the genre because good science fiction asks a lot of great questions about who we are, what our place in the universe is, and where we're going. Uh, and these are questions that all good literature does. Science fiction just does it in a different type of genre than what we're used to. And yeah, there's trash. There's trash science fiction out there. There's trash lots of other stuff too. Um, but I think the genre is better than society and literature credits give it credit for. Like it's a thought-provoking genre if you read the right stuff. So, but despite this, and I think it's getting better, but despite it, that label persists. Science fiction is not real literature. It's nobody thinks that any serious discussion of humanity is taking place within science fiction, and probably the people that think that are not reading science fiction. Within that book, The Great Derangement, Goosh uses the phrase climate fiction to talk about some of his works and some other works of fiction in which climate change plays a central role. And while the term has been around since 2013, and I even discussed a cli-fi novel before, The Ministry for the Future, I just didn't know the term. And I did some research into climate fiction, and that's how I found The Annual Migration of Clouds. Oh, what a book. Super good book. So, brief synopsis time. The novel is set in the future, maybe a century, a little bit after that, after some major event happens that has devastated civilization. It's climate caused, but we don't exactly know why. The story takes place at a former college in Alberta that has been converted into a colony of sorts. Other than cryptic clues about what happened in the past, we don't exactly know what happened. You can maybe guess and have some theories at it, but that information has been lost kind of to time. There are some like older people that, like really older people that lived through it, but they were kind of young and they don't really remember it, just that the lights went out. And ultimately, it doesn't matter. It happened. The characters in this book are dealing with it, and this is the story of survival. At one point, Reed, the main character, kind of reflects on the situation, and she says, "It was not instantaneous, the end of the world, the way it is in nightmares. No one back then would have been able to say, 'This is the day our world ended,' or even 'This is the year.' On a human scale, it was slow enough that for a long time it did not seem truly dire. On a geographical scale, it seemed that nothing was happening, till suddenly the feedback cycles tipped over, becoming too front heavy to regulate themselves. Nothing could be shipped or driven between cities, let alone countries. Parts could not be found or made to meet the maintenance needs of stopgaps, wind turbines, solar panels, and then the lights went out, flickered feebly on as governments and billionaires threw money at the problem. But money was no more help than marches. You cannot buy a new world into existence. And at last, the lights went out. So here we are, the survivors of the darkest years, the descendants of those who spent decades clawing back into the light. First off, I love the prose in this. Like, and the whole novel is like that. Just it's gripping. The words themselves are gripping. But just there's lines in there that stand out to me. On a human scale, it was slow enough that for a long time it did not seem truly dire. And we have that. We see people that are denying, even though we get warmer and warmer and warmer. But people say, "Oh, it's natural. It's fine." We get acclimated to it. I talked about that earlier on one of these shows too. I'm also it's kind of is blinking at me almost now. Um, Parts cannot be found or made to meet maintenance needs of stopgaps, and it's hard not to think of the instances in our economy now where goods are not being transported the way that we're used to. And that's not necessarily due to climate, it might be more due to the pandemic or um, work shortages, but we still are seeing the results of that. And maybe we are getting ever closer to that place where the feedback cycles tip over and we can't do anything about that. And I mean, we have kicked the climate can one too many times. Maybe we're destined to be like Yash and Mal, the two elderly women in this book who were there for when things went bad. We'll be the people that remember what it was way back when. And one of the things that I like that Mohamed writes is that we can't buy our way into a new world. We also need the desire and the drive to make the world more sustainable and more beneficial for everyone. We can't just throw money at the problem. Throwing money at a problem without the degree of follow through that's required is really just more patting ourselves on the back for doing a good job when actually nothing is happening. It's kind of like making sure that everybody uses reusable grocery bags, but not doing anything about industrial waste. Um, though I will say that money might help, and billionaires could do more to combat climate change and end world hunger and things like that instead of, sending themselves into space. Another really interesting part about this book is the CAD, and the CAD is super fascinating. I think the best way to describe the CAD would be a sentient fungal infection that people get. It's genetic, like it's passed down, um, generation to generation. And the CAD can actually control movements of people and quite possibly even control what they say. We're not totally sure about this, but there's hints that this happens. Usually, the CAD, like any good symbiotic pest, is trying to protect its host. It doesn't want the people that it's infected to die because then it dies. Um, I think at one point, Reed, the main character in this book, is willed to run from danger by her cat. Like it gets her out of a bad situation. And she says she could not run that fast without it. Um, so it's just kind of fascinating. The CAD can also, though, cause excruciating pain, especially when someone's near the end of their life. No one knows where it came from, and there is no cure. And it adds just a really interesting element to the book as well. So that's a little bit about the setting. The plot centers around Reed. She's a young woman, 17 or 18 years old. The novel begins with her being accepted to a university, but this is different because she's been in an isolated kind of commune for her entire life. And her mother has been in this isolated commune her entire life. Nobody knows what the outside world is like, and it's a dangerous trek to even go there. But she's been accepted to this university and she's excited. Um, and you might be thinking, well, that's the story of her going into this university and learning new things and meeting new people and da da da. But that's not what happens. Instead, she wrestles with the decision about whether or not she should go because she'd be leaving her mother behind. Her mother is also infected with CAD. And then it's also kind of an all hands on deck situation to keep the colony function. Her leaving would have a negative impact on things there. And I think that's interesting because we hear about taking individual actions having a negative impact on others on kind of both sides of the climate debate. Either the selfish actions of Reed endanger everyone, like the selfish actions of corporations and major pollutants harm us and future generations, or likewise, one of the most common reasons that we give for not going green, for not investing in green technologies, for not trying to make things sustainable is because it will have a negative economic impact on people. And so, likewise, Reed is faced with the decision. Does she go to benefit herself? But how will that negatively impact others? And ultimately, this is a story about how do we connect to other people and our environment. Um, One of the things that I think is kind of interesting with this is that, with economic impacts being the reason why we don't go green, we don't think about the good impacts that it'll have later on, like, Miami not being underwater, for instance. And likewise, Reed could come back with knowledge and help her people. She's not so sure that she can, but people float that as an option for her, so it's kind of interesting. Reed does ruminate as she is debating about what she should do. She says, what if the only way out was just wide enough for you and no one else? What if you promised to come back and knew it wasn't a promise you could keep to anyone for all time? What if you left and discovered that you didn't want to come back? What if the bone has to break? If love does not pin you down, if love is not heavy enough to keep you in place, what on earth could be? If love is not enough, then guilt cannot be enough, then duty cannot be enough. But what do they weigh? What is the heaviest? What could weigh you down? What's stopping you from doing the right thing by you? Likewise, what's keeping you there? And I think it's preservation. It's not a force that keeps you in one place, but a survival instinct that propels us forward. Reed's instinct is torn, but ultimately she will decide that she needs to take the risk and go and try to better her life. Which begs the question then, when does our preservation instinct push us towards sustainability? If we had CAD now, what might it do to protect us and itself? What actions would we take to make a better survival for all of us? At one point, Reed's mother says, don't apologize. You just want to make the world a better place. Now, Reed's mom is not on board with her leaving, quite possibly for selfish reasons. So we take that with a grain of salt, but still, it begs the question, what is the duty that we have to those around us? What's our duty to ourselves, to our future selves, to future generations? What do we owe not just the people that we interact with on a daily basis, but the people who will come after we even die? Do we owe them anything? Now, books like The Ministry for the Future, and I would argue The Annual Migration of Clouds, say, yes, we owe them a lot. We can make decisions now that will make their lives easier. But it's also really easy for us as humans to say, we don't owe them anything. And what will my individual life matter? What will my individual choices matter to people who aren't even born yet? But then what do we owe to ourselves and to our future selves? I think we owe our future selves a lot. And that can be as simple as making sure that you stay hydrated and you go to bed at a reasonable time. And the you of tomorrow is going to feel a lot better. But also, the decisions that you make today have a massive impact, or can have a massive impact, on your future self. Where you go to school, whether or not you obey the law, if you say yes to that date. All these things can have massive implications for our future selves, and maybe even to future generations if you think about it. So, we at least owe some thought to the matter, I think, as we go through this. One of the things that I'm interested in, and sometimes I don't usually think about these things, but just the juxtaposition of what's on the cover really stood out to me. And it's the blurb that another author wrote. And it says, the climate crisis is real, and the annual migration of clouds is must read fiction. And just that juxtaposition between real and fiction is becoming blurred within the genre of climate fiction. And I think it's summed up beautifully in that one sentence. And I really think that it's time for this type of fiction to be taken seriously, whether that is science fiction as a genre or climate fiction as a subgenre. It's an art that's trying to warn us of a dire future. The warnings, the models, the thought of what will happen next are becoming more and more dire. And we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to the people around us, we owe it to our future selves, and yes, we owe it to those future generations to think about the impact that we might have on all of those folks today, and what can we do to make it a better life for them tomorrow. Thanks as always for watching. uh, I cannot recommend this book enough. It's The Annual Migration of Clouds. Buy it, check it out at your library, read it. uh, I hope it sticks with you as much as it has with me. The prose is amazing, the characters are great, the setting is really, really intriguing, and I think that this is a really good addition into climate fiction. It also doubles as a great young adult novel. So if you have younger readers, I think they would like it too. I think this, though, impacts older folks as well. So thank you as always for watching. We're near the end of October, and I'm almost done with my spooky book for the month, and I will probably do an episode on that as well because I'm really into it. So, but until then, cheers and happy reading.